Hi, I'm Ahmed Shabuddin.
I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Today, South Africa's plans to break ties with the International Criminal Court and the impact that will have on the court's effectiveness. We quit. That's the message South Africa, Burundi, and now Gambia are sending to the International Criminal Court. Their reason? They believe the ICC, which is designed to tackle gross human rights violations, pursues a disproportionate number of cases against African countries.
Here's a little background on the ICC. It's governed by an international treaty called the Rome Statute that was signed and ratified by more than 120 countries in 1998. Since then, all 23 cases tried before the court have involved African nations. In fact, 9 of its 10 current investigations are related to countries in Africa.
So why so much focus on Africa? The ICC's extent of power is limited. It can only investigate crimes in countries that ratified the Rome Statute. To get involved anywhere else, the court needs a referral from the United Nations Security Council, where the United States, China, and Russia have veto power. None of these countries have ratified the Rome Statute, so they don't fall under the jurisdiction of the ICC, making it unlikely they would ever refer themselves.
News of African states abandoning the court is stirring division within the African Union. Some countries want to leave, while others want to stay. In fact, the African Union is debating whether to endorse a mass exodus of its members from the ICC. If they do, what does this mean for Africa, the future of the court, and the ability to hold people accountable if human rights abuses are committed? Joining us via Skype in South Africa to discuss this is Michael Masuta. He's South Africa's Minister of Justice and Correctional Services.
In Johannesburg, Angela Mudukuti. She's an international criminal justice lawyer. Also in Johannesburg, political analyst Oscar van Heerden. And lastly, Saul Musker. He's a student in Johannesburg and a contributor at the Daily Maverick. Welcome everyone to the stream. I want to get started on my laptop. So this news broke Tuesday that Gambia has decided to break with the ICC. Now, in a statement seen here in this article via Al Jazeera and the Al Jazeera English website, Sharif Bojang, Gambia's information minister, said the decision is, quote, warranted by the fact that the ICC, despite being called International Criminal Court, is in fact an international Caucasian court for the persecution and humiliation of people of color, especially Africans. Minister, is this a fair assessment of the ICC?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily want to cast aspersions over the institution. What prompted us, and I can only speak for ourselves as a country, was because of the legal difficulties primarily that we experienced in working with the court.
Legal difficulties like what? Make that clear for our audience.
Well, first of all, we were under the, now it turns out, erroneous impression that the statute read as a whole was complementary rather than having elements of contradiction. So, for example, Article 27, as we understood it, would not be interpreted to suggest that it actually nullifies Article 98, because Article 98 seems to recognize continued application of the customary international law of diplomatic immunity that would enable us as a country and all other countries in the world which subscribe to the Rome Statute, the ability to extend diplomatic immunity, even in instances where they could be accused of crimes committed under the statute, but for the fact that diplomatic immunity has been extended to them.
Okay, so I hear two things here. So I hear from this Gambia statement the idea that there's a bias towards African countries, and I hear what you're saying is, as for South Africa, one of the things that you took issue with was the lack of being able to allow diplomatic immunity for leaders. Angela, I want you to weigh in here on those two things and whether or not you think that they are reason enough to leave the ICC.
I don't think they're reason enough to leave the ICC, because if you look at a majority of the cases currently before the court, a lot of them are self-referrals where autonomous, independent African governments have referred the situation in their own country to the ICC. So it's more Africans making use of the court they helped create, because let's not forget, there wouldn't be an international criminal court were it not for the African votes that brought the Rome Statute into force. So that's the first element. And then with regard to South Africa domestically, South Africa not only signed and ratified the Rome Statute, but South Africa domesticated it, made it law in this country, domestic law in this country. And at that point, every single provision of the legislation was carefully considered, and a conscious decision was made to make sure that there is no immunity for heads of state or senior government officials, because no one is above the law.
You know, when you bring that up, no one being above the law, we have a lot of comments coming in. I'm not going to read them all, but Malika, you kind of brought this up. A lot of people confused or even frustrated that, it seems as though Africa gets the wrong end of the stick. Yeah, the short end of the stick, exactly. Dylan saying on Twitter, the AU should set up its own criminal court. We can't be under imperialism anymore. Who's messed up? Syria, Libya, Iraq, charge them. A lot of people drawing different ways of drawing the same conclusion, which is that Africans see the ICC as a neocolonialism tool used by the West. Until all United Nations Security Council joins the ICC, the perception would not change. So with that in mind, and all these kinds of discussions about why then is it only Africa, what do you think about that? I mean, doesn't this really just pave the way for other people to follow in suit? Angela?
Well, it doesn't actually, because it's true. The ICC does have a disproportionate number of African cases, but at the end of the day, if you look at all those cases, there is evidence that suggests crimes have been committed and they should be investigated. However, what I will say is part of the ICC's problem is the United Nations Security Council referral, where permanent members can veto referrals, and permanent members, 3 of the 5, who are not signatories to the Rome Statute. So that also adds to this perception of bias. I don't think that the ICC itself is targeting Africa, and I also think that African states, who, by the way, constitute the biggest regional bloc of signatories, need to proactively engage with the ICC to amend this perception and to amend situations where bias has been generated. But there's been very little engagement in that respect. And now it seems the solution is to withdraw, which I don't think is constructive. I don't think bodes well for the victims of these crimes. And particularly because our own domestic systems haven't been able to try genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity effectively.
So I hear you saying, Angela, that you don't necessarily think that it's bias. Oscar, I want you to bring you in here. A couple of people on Twitter saying that they think the exact opposite. So this is MG, who says, because they refuse to prosecute Bush, the former U.S. president, despite obvious evidence that he committed war crimes. Another person, this is Omar on Twitter, saying, I agree, because Israel, USA, Britain, and some other big shots have committed multiple crimes, but they weren't even questioned. Oscar, bias, does that play a role here?
No, absolutely. I mean, thanks, Malika. In terms of my article, I take issue precisely with this duality phenomenon. The fact that rights and responsibilities within the international system seems to being applied differently depending on whether you are in the powerful category and the north, and whether you are in the weak, which is in the south. And for me, that really is the crux of the matter. I mean, just to respond to one thing that Angela said, when she says we've domesticated the Rome Statute with our own customary laws within South Africa, indeed that did happen. But I'm sure as someone who takes an interest in legal issues, you can never cover all the grounds. Law is always subject to interpretation. There's always contradictions. And depending on which jurist you are approaching, they will have different interpretations of the very law. And so I think that the fact that the South African government has now, at this point, having experienced a particular challenge with regards to Omar al-Bashir, have now realized that perhaps there is some contradiction, is wanting the courts in South Africa to clarify that issue.
So I just want to explain for our audience, because you mentioned Omar Bashir, the president of Sudan. And so the case here is that South Africa was beholden to arrest al-Bashir when he set foot on South African soil under the terms of the ICC. And he wasn't arrested. This happened last year when he came for a summit. Ahmed, I know the community has a lot to say about this.
Yeah, you know, they're saying a lot of different things about the decision, but also the decision-making process itself. Take a look at this. Shamim saying, I think the decision to leave the ICC should be done by citizens, not just leaders with selfish interests. We also have Major General saying, oops, excuse me there, well, I think South Africa should have fought rather, within the ICC, not pulling out. Saul, would that have made more sense in this particular case for you?
Absolutely. I mean, to go back to what the minister said at the beginning of this show, the argument that the South African government has made is that we are obliged to arrest heads of state, for example, who are sought by the ICC when they visit our country, and that prevents us from pursuing peace negotiations, for example. But the first point to make is that the Rome Statute itself actually protects states from having to surrender any suspect to the court in contravention of their international obligations. The minister himself referenced Article 98 of the treaty, which provides that states, don't have to do that. So there is a way around having to arrest leaders like al-Bashir if that's what the South African government is really concerned about. But even if
can we not leave that point, because I think it is at the heart of this issue.
Go ahead, Minister.
The fact of the matter is that is one interpretation which we ourselves believe in until we are judged differently. The pre-trial chamber, in the middle of consultations under Article 97, having invited us to come forth for such consultations, went ahead and unilaterally decided before those consultations were concluded without our presence that South Africa was under an obligation and therefore effectively trumping Article 98. But in other cases elsewhere in Africa, they seem to have adopted a different position, and we're talking of the same judicial chamber who is supposed to adjudicate on this matter. So if even that body is confused about what the correct interpretation is,
Minister,
hence we approach the
If I could just interject there, I think there's a misrepresentation of the facts, because South African courts, the High Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal, also confirmed that there was a duty to arrest President Omar al-Bashir as per South African legislation. So it's one thing to talk about discrepancies at the International Criminal Court, but if you look at the domestic framework and what the courts have said, it's clear.
The story is not complete.
The
story is not complete. Supreme Court of Appeal did acknowledge continued application of international customary law affording diplomatic immunity.
So I wonder if we are arguing, though, over a technicality, and it's a question. I'm just putting this out there. I wonder if that's a technicality, because at the end of the day, South Africa wants to withdraw from the ICC. What effect will that then have on the ICC or other countries who are looking at South Africa who say maybe we want to withdraw as well? Ahmed, you want to get in there?
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like a lot of people, beyond thinking that this will spark a trend, they feel like the way in which this happened was the wrong way, as I mentioned earlier. But we also have Chris Robertson, Minister, chiming in saying, South Africa must commit to international institutions. This is a personal move for Zuma, not done in the national interest, and entrenches polarization in the country. There have been many people echoing that same sentiment with different tweets. What do you make of that, Minister?
Let me just come in, Ahmed.
Just
to come in, I think that we need to make a very clear distinction between legal and political, because I think that's where we sort of conflating issues.
So make it for us.
I think that, from a legal point of view and from a legal standpoint, I think there are merits and demerits for the argument, not only in the al-Bashir case, but also some of the points that Saul made, for example, in response to my article, where he makes valid points about the prosecutorial decisions, the self-referrals. Those are all the legal issues. But the point that some people are not wanting to accept is that there is also a political argument here. that the system is unjust, that it's about the North and the South, the powerful and the weak, that it's about what, for example, Africa feels is happening within the ICC context. And so I just think that we shouldn't really conflate the issues of legality as well as the issues of politics, because I think that's where the things get confused.
So I hear you making that argument that the system is, some believe the system is unjust. I want to direct your attention to this. This is a statement from the president of the Assembly of the ICC, Sidiki Kaba, who says the president of the Assembly is concerned that this disturbing signal would open the way to other African states withdrawing from the Rome Statute, thus weakening the only permanent international criminal court in charge of prosecuting the most serious crimes that shock the conscience. Saul, I want to bring you in here because basically the statement is saying this is the one avenue or one of the avenues that the world has to prosecute things like genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity.
Well, exactly. I mean, the South African government has said that it has a problem with the Rome Statute and with the court. And instead of trying to resolve that problem within the system, to try to reform the court in such a way that the international criminal justice system is preserved, the government has chosen to simply withdraw from the court in a way that will potentially deal a very decisive blow to the system as a whole. And that's the sad...
Listen, we did that precisely because we tried exactly what you're saying. We made representations at the ASP in November last year. We said to them that under international law of interpretation, the state parties, have the power to give proper interpretation of the statute so that you eliminate the ambiguity. We said conversely, you can amend the statute to create legal certainty and in the process clarify for countries so that we're not finding ourselves in similar situations. Right now, South Africa's diplomatic system is hamstrung. Our ability to engage in diplomatic relations is being limited by this continued legal uncertainty.
Minister,
with respect,
go ahead, respond. Go ahead, then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, with respect to the minister, though, that entirely misses the point, which is that this decision is effectively throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The effect of this decision, especially if other African states follow suit and withdraw from the Rome Statute, the effect will be to deny justice to the victims of major human rights atrocities in Africa and elsewhere, because it will undermine the only institution in the world.
Look what you started there. So I want to give the minister just a sentence to respond to that, and then we're going to get to our community because I know they have a lot to say.
No, it's not entirely true. We have a system of mutual legal assistance with or without bilateral agreements with most countries in the world. Our own statutory provisions allow us for extradition of fugitives of justice anywhere else in the world on a daily basis. As Minister of Justice, I assign people out of this country who are fugitives of justice elsewhere. But over and above that, Africa is in the process of strengthening its own processes over and above many other international instruments that we ourselves as South Africa are signatory.
Minister, if I may, forgive me for interrupting you, Minister, but obviously, we could go back and forth on this for a long time, but since we're talking about the very relevance of the court, just want to read a quick tweet and then get to a video comment that came in. Muhammad Tanha saying, who even knows if politicians decided to quit the ICC to put themselves above the law for their future planned crimes? Perhaps that's a little bit of a, conspiratorial approach, but many people do believe it.
Strong legal systems in this country.
I understand, Minister.
Which will never allow that.
Well, there are many people who would look to history. Well, many people would look to history and challenge that point of view. But to keep the conversation moving, Angela, I want to get
gone past that.
I understand. I want to get your thoughts on this video.
What we've seen in the last couple of days, despite a number of troubling withdrawals, is other states also say that they remain committed to the International Criminal Court and will remain members. I also don't think it'll change in terms of those states who see the ICC as a useful means to target their own domestic adversaries. And finally, I think looking beyond the International Criminal Court's role in Africa, I think what we see is a trajectory in which the ICC has become a more relevant player in the Middle East and North Africa. And we see this in places like Iraq, in Syria, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth.
So the court more relevant in the Middle East. What are your thoughts on that? The very relevance of the court.
Yeah, no,
Angela?
Ahmed, can I just
I
come
think
in?
the very relevance
Go ahead.
of the court is currently in jeopardy, given that there seems to be a lot of initiative to withdraw from the court. But I think Mark Kirsten is right in pointing that the court has opened investigations or preliminary examinations in other areas outside of Africa. So I think there is great potential for development in that respect.
Oscar, I know you've been trying to get in there. Oscar, go ahead.
Just two things. I mean, I think the one thing is that I think it's quite, I don't know how else to put it, Malaika, but it's quite insulting to refer to the ICC in a way that says that Africa as a continent can't actually prosecute crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. I mean, you know, the Afro-pessimistic argument that because we haven't yet gotten out of the starting blocks, and that we are simply not going to be able to do it as Africans is quite alarming, to say the least. There has been no fair period being given to the African Union and to Africans to actually say that we can resolve our own problems. We can indeed prosecute those that are violating. I mean, the former head of state in Chad is a typical example where it went through the process of prosecute. He's now going to serve life imprisonment. Of course, he's appealing, but we'll see how that goes. But that is the clearest indication that times are changing in Africa, that your dictators are actually being held accountable by their citizens. And so I think this notion that we must simply just throw our lot in with the ICC because we somehow can't do it as the African Union is rather insulting, to say the least. That's the first point.
The sad thing about
The second point I
Wait,
wanted to
okay,
make.
so let's, because your first point obviously has a lot of responses, Saul and then Angela. Saul, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, the sad thing about this is that amidst all of the lofty rhetoric about Afro-pessimism and neo-imperialism, the victims of human rights abuses in African countries where the ICC is the only institution willing and capable to intervene, those victims have been forgotten. If you ask the heads of state, if you ask heads of state in Africa,
that is just simply
if you ask
untrue.
heads of state
Because
in
we
Africa,
have-
if
we
they
have
oppose the
peacekeeping-
ICC,
So
they'll
let's
say yes.
let Saul finish his sentence. If we ask heads of state in
Hold
Africa,
on,
go
hold
ahead.
on. If you ask heads of state in Africa, if you ask Kenyatta in Kenya or Nkurunziza in Burundi, they'll tell you that the ICC is a tool of the West. But if you ask the victims of major atrocities in Sudan, in Libya, elsewhere, they will tell you that the ICC is the only institution, their only hope of getting justice for the crimes that have been committed against them. Those victims need to be at the center of this
Okay,
debate.
so I hear you there, and I hear Oscar wanting to respond. Angela's also nodding her head. I want to bring this tweet in because this is a direct response, a little bit shorter probably. Wandi says, justice is not justice if applied selectively. Why are the major Western countries not members of the ICC? Angela, we haven't heard your voice in a while.
Okay, so first of all, on this issue of Africa and Afro-pessimism, nobody is saying that Africans cannot do it. We are just saying that it has not been done yet. And whilst we are trying to establish those systems, we need to support existing systems. We have an African court that has no criminal jurisdiction. And as I indicated earlier, our domestic courts don't have the legislative framework and the capacity to deal with international crimes. So we support domestic justice, we support regional justice, but we also support international justice because these systems work together.
And Angela,
with regard to the tweet,
Angela, we could continue and go back and forth on this for so long, but I do want to sneak in a video comment that we got because I mentioned earlier that Natalia had sent us a video comment, and it kind of wraps up the conversation really nicely. Take a listen. Let's all take a listen to what she had to say.
When we speak about South Africa's withdrawal from the ICC, it is important to mention that the ICC is the first international criminal court that allowed victims to participate in the proceedings. In that sense, it has respected the voices of people who suffered the most during wars. If South Africa would withdraw from the ICC, its citizens will be stripped of that hope that in case grave crimes would be committed against them, the perpetrators would face fair trials.
We'll talk about her point on victims in the post-show, stream.aljazeera.com. See you there. Welcome back. This is the Stream's post-show online. We're discussing what's next for the ICC after at least 3 countries have announced they want to leave the body. Angela, we had to cut you off just at the end of the show there, and you were referencing a tweet that we read from Wandi, who said, "Justice is not justice if it's applied selectively." Do you want to finish your thought there?
Absolutely, and she's correct. And we need to name and shame those states who refuse to sign the Rome Statute and contribute to the system of international justice. There is no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean we need to ignore the criminals we do have jurisdiction over in the interim.
And, with that in mind, Angela, the reason I wanted to get to that video comment in the main show is because, it's focusing on the victims, rather. And Natalia had also sent us, in the spirit of transparency, another video that we weren't able to play that also touched on South Africa's withdrawal from the ICC being a disappointment to her because she felt this was made in a country that has suffered under apartheid for decades, as you, of course, know all too well, and that the reason to quit, in her view, is to guarantee impunity for sitting leaders. Did you have a chance to hear her comment, and what would you respond to Natalia directly?
Well, let me indicate the following. Regime change through extraneous intervention has proven over and over again to only lead to more mayhem, more bloodshed, and more instability. It's happened in Iraq, it's happened in Syria, it's happened everywhere else in the world. It does not solve the problem, even for victims, because all it does is create more victims. So we as South Africans achieved our own democracy through dialogue led by our President Mandela, and we want to export that political experience elsewhere in the world, promoting dialogue, promoting political understanding, pushing for peace and sustainable peace so that prosperity can take root in Africa and elsewhere where political instability has resulted in atrocities. To simply ignore the realities that to try and unseat a sitting head of state is simply to provoke more conflict.
I understand.
It's naive and unrealistic.
I understand your point. I just, and the reason, again, I'm kind of sharing this tweet with you that I think I may have mentioned in the main show from Shamim is, with regards to the citizens who you represent, Shamim saying, I think the decision to leave the ICC should be done by the citizens, not just the leaders, because then it opens up some criticism that this is all just very selfish.
Yeah. Let me answer simply that question. Our Constitution prescribes how the different arms of state should exercise their responsibilities of powers. In this instance, our Section 231 of our Constitution imposes the responsibility to negotiate and sign international agreements on the executive, full stop. It does not require the executive to negotiate with Parliament or to negotiate with any other institution.
Let alone represent the interests of the citizens.
If we were to establish a new precedent here, the big question that would be asked is, have we constitutionally entered into international agreements correctly in the past 2 decades, given the fact that we didn't follow that procedure, which, by the way, is not provided for in our rules in Parliament, it's not provided for anywhere in the Constitution itself. So people are asking us suddenly, because we're dealing with this issue, to change the rules in the Constitution, in the law, and try and introduce a procedure which is not provided for anywhere in our law.
I think there are some who would disagree with that assessment there, but I want to shift gears just a little bit, because we reached out to former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General of the UN at the time of the founding of the ICC. He couldn't join the show today, but he directed us to comments he made in 2013 saying that his views haven't changed. Take a look at my laptop here. He says, I think there is quite a serious misunderstanding about the role of the ICC. It's a court of last resort. Ideally, government government should try people at home. He goes on to say, but if these countries go and fight the ICC and try to take the cases out when they don't have an alternative and aren't worried about the victims, if they fight against it, vote against it, it would be a badge of shame for each and every one of them and their country. So that raises the question, Oscar, of what those alternatives should look like, what they do look like. I know earlier you were mentioning that it would be patronizing to think that African countries couldn't solve these problems themselves. I want to direct you to this tweet. This is someone who says, how will there be a unified court that will fight impunity in such a diverse continent as Africa? Subjective choice by nations? What would that look like for you? What does that look like for you, Oscar?
Yeah, thanks, Malika. And I think I just want to say the notion that somehow it's rather patronizing from Saul to say that it's only the ICC that victims look at, and it's the only the ICC that can solve our crimes against humanity and genocide and so forth. You know, as the African Union, my understanding is that South Africa and many other nations are involved in active peacekeeping and peace-building processes on the continent to ensure that the very victims that he's referring to don't necessarily get into situations of war crimes and genocide and so on. And so there is a lot of examples of African nations, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and many others that are actively involved in pushing back extremists, Boko Haram, and many other groups to try and avoid a situation where we slide into chaos. And that is done precisely because we have the interest of victims at the center of our actions. So to think that there's no alternatives, that there's no alternatives because the court is the
so
only
Oscar,
thing
you mentioned
can
Saul.
do
Saul
that.
now has a response. Go ahead, Saul.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, African peacekeeping efforts and initiatives about justice on the continent are not mutually exclusive from the existence of the ICC. But you
said that it's only the ICC that can help victims.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot deny
that is incorrect.
You cannot deny that there are certain cases at present, and there will be in the future, certain cases in which there is no other institution in existence that is capable of intervening to bring justice for victims. That's certainly the case in Sudan. It's the case in Libya, in Kenya, and Cote d'Ivoire. We do not have institutions in Africa that are well developed enough at present to do the work that the ICC is doing.
On that point, and this back and forth is interesting, but I want to come to you, Oscar, with this tweet that came in from Alan, asking kind of rhetorical questions, but also we'll put one of them to you. Alan saying, what is the alternative to the ICC? The African Union Court lacks resources and commitment. And then he asks, has South Africa signed the African Union's International Criminal Justice Protocol? Sorry about that. He answers that question saying no. Angela, I see you nodding. What do you make of that?
That is 100% correct. There are no regional mechanisms that have criminal jurisdiction to deal with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the existing African court, by the way, South Africa itself has not signed the new protocol that would potentially give this court criminal jurisdiction. And so I see a lot of inconsistencies as far as suggesting that there are alternative mechanisms. Currently, there are not. There are no alternative mechanisms.
So I want to give the last word to the Minister Michael Massoud. Is this a done deal? What do we have to look forward to next? What comes next?
Well, let me just confirm that South Africa is in the process of considering signing the protocol. It is true that we're not yet signatory to the protocol. But let me also indicate that even at an international level, South Africa is a party to a number of international instruments that give extraterritorial, and we have domesticated them, giving us extraterritorial jurisdiction to try certain serious human rights violations, such as the anti-terrorism and anti-torture conventions.
So, Minister, then in answer to my question now, what comes next? Is this a done deal?
Yes, of course. The Republic of South Africa, having explored all avenues as directed by the ruling party in October last year, we have come to the conclusion that we have failed in our attempts over the past year. to try and seek solutions within the ICC system itself, and that we're left with no option but to withdraw. And what's left now is for Parliament to consider proposed legislation, which we'll be tabling shortly, that would deal with the final aspect, and that is to repeal the domestication.
Okay, you heard it here first. Minister Michael Masuta said we're left with no option. Unfortunately, we are out of time. A big thank you to all of our guests, Michael Masuta, Angela Mujukuti, Oscar Van Heerden, Saul Musker, and our community, which is where I do want to end with these two tweets. This is Natalia, who says, I'm afraid Nelson Mandela would be very sad and disappointed with South Africa's decision to withdraw from the ICC. On the other hand, Mortala says, Africans see the ICC as a neocolonialism tool used by the West. And until all of the UN Security Council joins the ICC, this perception won't change. Ahmed, it's been quite a conversation.
Yeah, I have a feeling this is one of those, Malika, that will really continue.
Right, and we will revisit it. Until next time, though, we'll see you online.